Greetings, my scattered brothers and sisters in the Lord. Trust you know the Lord is with you wherever you find yourself scattered today, and that you know that His presence with you is more than enough for whatever you might face today. We are entering into Mark chapter 11. This is the third section of the Gospel of Mark. And the Gospel of Mark, kind of big picture. Chapter 1 through chapter 8, verse 22, the big question is, who is Jesus? He's doing miracles, he's teaching, he has authority like people have never seen, he's healed people, he's cast out demons, and the big question is, who is he? And nobody seems to know. Well, the demons knew, but nobody else really seems to know. And then we get our first miracle of Jesus healing a blind man. And so it's kind of like through those first 8 chapters, Jesus is doing these miracles and nobody really sees clearly. And finally, Jesus heals a blind man. And after Jesus heals that blind man in chapter 8, verses 22 to 26, then Jesus asks the question, who do you say that I am? And Peter, for the first time, sees that Jesus is the Christ. And so the big first question is, who is Jesus? And finally, after the healing of a blind man, Peter is able to say, you are the Christ. That takes us to the next big section of the Gospel of Mark. And that's chapter 8, 27, all the way through chapter 10. And now the question is, how is Jesus going to bring God's kingdom? Okay, so they got it figured out. He's the Christ. He's the one who brings God's kingdom, the Messiah. So then Jesus starts to teach them how he's going to do it. And so that's kind of the next big question. Jesus, you're the Christ. How are you going to bring God's kingdom? How are you going to usher in God's rule, God's victory over evil? And Jesus begins to teach them that he's going to do it by going to the cross. And none of them see this. None of them understand this. And he teaches them 3 times and they still don't get it. They're arguing about who's the greatest. James and John, they want to sit at Jesus' right and left. They have no idea what they're asking. And so they see, but they're kind of blind. They really don't get it, that God's kingdom comes through Jesus going to the cross, and the way that we participate in the kingdom is through following Jesus, through denying ourselves, through taking up our cross and putting Jesus first no matter what. And so at the end of this section, we have the second time that a blind person is healed. Blind Bartimaeus. He's crying out, Son of David, have mercy on me. He recognizes that Jesus is the Messiah. And what do you want me to do for you? I want to see. And Jesus heals him, and now he is following Jesus along the way to Jerusalem, along the way to the cross. And so that brings us to the third big section of the Gospel of Mark. It starts in chapter 11. And this is the account of Jesus going to Jerusalem, and Jesus is going to bring God's kingdom through going to the cross. And so we pick it up, Mark chapter 11, verse 1, pretty familiar. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples, saying to them, go to the village ahead of you, and just as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, why are you doing this? Say, the Lord needs it and will send it back here shortly. They went and found a colt outside in the street, tied at a doorway. As they untied it, some people standing there asked, what are you doing untying that colt? They answered as Jesus had told them to, and the people let them go. When they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks over it, he sat on it. And many people spread their cloaks on the road, while others spread branches that they had cut in the fields. And we're going to stop there. We'll continue on the next time. But I want to call your attention to just a couple things. Number one, Jesus is riding this colt, going to ride this colt into Jerusalem. He is bringing God's kingdom. He is entering as the Messiah King, and he is going to establish God's rule. So that's exciting. Now, what I want us to think about for a moment today, those 2 disciples, they're unnamed. Jesus sent 2 disciples ahead, and he tells them, when you get there, you're going to find this colt, and I want you to untie him and bring him to me. And if anyone says, what are you doing? Just tell them the Lord needs it, and the Lord will return it. And so they go. what's interesting is that they're nameless. And so all through the Gospel of Mark has had no problem, naming disciples. There's a lot of unnamed people for sure. But when Jesus calls Peter and Andrew, James and John, we get their names. When Jesus identifies the 12, we get their names. Peter's the one who says, "You're the Christ." Peter, James, and John were the ones taken up to the Mount of Transfiguration. It's James and John that are asking the question. We want to sit at your, making the request. We want to sit at your right and your left. So Mark has no problem naming disciples. And yet here, Jesus sends 2 disciples, we don't know their names, to get the donkey. And it's quite the contrast, because we just had James and John asking to sit at Jesus' right and left. We have a blind man, we know his name, Bartimaeus, and he's healed, and he follows Jesus. And now 2 disciples are sent, and we don't get their names, but they go and do what Jesus told them to do. They go and bring back the donkey. I can't help but wonder if those 2 unnamed disciples are the same 2 disciples that were asking to sit at Jesus' right and left. They went from wanting seats of notoriety and power to being willing, unnamed, to go get the donkey. I just can't help but wonder. But I'm kind of thinking the type of disciples that Jesus wants, the type of disciples that will follow Jesus to the cross, they don't really care about their name. They just care about being obedient. And maybe they're actually seeing for the first time that it's not about our name, that it's about our obedience. And so they go and they get the donkey and they bring it back to Jesus, and they place their own cloaks on it for Jesus to ride. Well, that's the thought I really want to leave with you today. That it's not about our name, it's not about our notoriety, it's about our obedience. And may God give us the grace and the humility to simply obey and not worry about getting our names mentioned. God bless. Have a great day. Be obedient to Jesus. Don't worry about your name getting mentioned. I assure you, Jesus knows who you are. Have a great day and God bless.